Okay, welcome back everyone. It is July 7 of 2015. We're going to continue with our look at the foundation of ethics for Brentano. We've already looked at the first and second moment briefly, but we're going to take a look at some additional aspects in those two moments. If you look at the first moment, in addition to the percepts and the axiomatic expansion of the axioms of epistemology, we learn that we also have a Aristotelian in itself generic concept for the right end of ethics, which is called the practical good. And it is a generic concept, it's a hyphenated concept of Aristotle's Kalliston-To-Dikaion. Kalliston-To-Dikaion. And it means the most beautiful or the most noble, because this word for beauty is actually nobility. The most beautiful righteousness, the most noble righteousness is our generic concept. It's beauty as a judgment of moral taste. It's beauty that can be cognitively reasoned about. So our ethical stance becomes an aesthesis, or an aspect of the aesthetics of moral beauty. In the second moment, the only new material that we have is going to be the fourth note, note number 4, where we internalize this generic concept of Kalliston-To-Dikaion through analytic and aesthetic judgment. The criterion is interrelatedness, because now we take those generalizations and we're going to relate them to each other into a sign model. And it's a twofold process. While we get involved in interrelation, we're also raising generalization to signification. So we're through this comparison and analogy, we also reach signification at the same time we form the model. So interrelatedness and signification go hand in hand. We form a model of a relation of the general ideas that we did grasp in existential judgment, and it's based on internalizing the critique of the Kalliston-To-Dikaion, which will raise the generalizations to signification. So we end up with a two-dimensional model with a three-dimensional character. We do also perceive it as possessing a cyclical eschatological continuum, or a trajectory toward a future. So then we can move on to universality, the third moment. We've discussed that before in epistemology, but basically here we're going to take a look at the self-existence of these signs moving toward a universality. Through analogy and comparison, the self forms that disposition toward universality. Remember, in epistemology we talked about this. Universality is an internal disposition carried by the self. So it's always a probability, never a certainty. It's a probability that will seek verification and validation through intersubjective return of knowing, return of recognition. So we form a disposition toward universality through various analogous work and comparison. But he does give us a little additional information here. He says we do enlist the following aspects to form this critique. Perfection, which means we do critique the significations according to an overall relational harmony of a whole, a holistic harmony. We enlist the freedom, and that means we critique the significations as corresponding to that insight of the aesthetic beauty, which was the Kalliston-To-Dikaion. And then we take up the ethical moment here, and we infuse the significations with the praxis tendency to go out of themselves on the behalf of others, is ethical work and ethical positing. We unite this Kalliston-To-Dikaion with justice by respecting the rights of boundary of others gathered at the dialogue threshold. Then finally, we're going to posit this sign model to reach a return of recognition. And by doing so, we will receive return after return after return, and eventually significations will reach a universality through being intersubjectively validated. They will become separately available for ethical and cognitive work. At the same time, we do acquire that, as we remember from epistemology, that temporal direction as a teleosis. We do see the trajectory of the eschatological tendency of this psychical reality for these significations that have been raised to universality. So now we're ready to form an ethical model, and the ethical model is the ethical relational coincidence that we want to imprint over the signs as our view as to the probable direction toward nobility and moral righteousness that we perceive. We want to imprint those universal significations with our ethical relational coincidence. And so we posit our ethical probability toward this original Aristotelian concept of Kalliston-To-Dikaion, or the most noble righteousness. So it all boils down to the fact that Brentano does have a generic concept as an in-itself concept that he begins his ethics with. He doesn't begin with bare experience. He begins with content, both in content and form, because he begins, if you look at that first moment, he begins with percepts, of course, but we have an axiomatic base of the epistemological propositions. We have a generic concept. We don't begin at ground zero. We begin with a generic concept and an accrued base of propositional epistemological truths that inform our motivational base of attestation. Now our motivation, well, basically our motivation has a twofold informing. It's informed by the axiomatic expansion. It's informed by the generic concept of Kalliston-To-Dikaion. So Brentano in no way begins with a bare nothingness. He begins with a twofold empowered motivational base of attestation, which will absolutely inform and instruct the analytical work in the second moment of internalizing this concept and moving toward the posited imprint of our directional teleosis. So we get a little extra material here. He gives us a little bit more to go on, but basically when you couple this with his epistemology, his ethics is so unbelievably centered in Aristotle that there's no way that it is anything that begins with pure phenomenology. It begins with generic concept. It begins with axiomatic pre-understanding, and both of those inform a motivational base, which absolutely will color and filter all analytic work in the second moment. It will most definitely be informed through this motivational base that has a twofold imprint. So it's a great additional look at his foundation of ethics, but his foundation of ethics is Aristotle all the way, and it begins with Aristotle's generic concept. It begins with Aristotle's logic, his axiomatic expansions of propositional truth for logic, and so Brentano is very much rooted in a Aristotelian ethics. And that will take us up, believe it or not, I have a feeling there's going to be quite a bit of content in the latter portion of this volume, because this is all the way up through page 102, and you can see we didn't gain a whole lot of additional material over the epistemology we've already studied. So thus far, it's a lot of reading to gain a little bit of content. So I'm not as impressed with this volume as I have with the previous volumes. I have been more impressed with the previous volumes, but it is worth getting the additional little insights. So we will continue on, but I have a feeling we're going to get quite a bit of concentrated material toward the end. And that'll wrap up this second look at the foundation of ethics.